In the year 1917, in the Kingdom of Siam, the country we now call Thailand, a group of fishermen were going about their morning routine on the banks of the Chao Phraya River. Something caught their eye in the shallow water near the temple pier. A large iron chest, heavy, sealed shut. In those days, only the wealthy owned chests like this, used to store gold, jewelry, valuables. So the fishermen did what anyone hoping for treasure would do. They pried it open. Inside, they did not find gold. They found a human body. This was not the only iron chest that would be pulled from the rivers and canals of Bangkok in those years. Before it was over, at least 7 people, possibly more, would be found the same way, sealed in iron, weighted with bricks, sunk like garbage no one was ever supposed to find. And the man responsible for putting them there was not a soldier, not a gangster, not a hardened criminal with a violent past. He was a Buddhist monk, a man the public saw walking the streets of Bangkok in saffron robes, blessing worshippers, performing sacred rituals, offering prayers for good fortune. His name was Boonpeng. History would come to know him by another name entirely, Iron Chest Boonpeng. To understand how a monk became one of the most feared killers in Thai history, we need to go back to the very beginning of his life, to a quiet village far from the temples and canals of Bangkok, where he would later become infamous. Boonpeng was born around the year 1890 in a district called Ta Uten, a remote area resting along the banks of the Mekong River in what was then called Udon Province, today part of Nakhon Phanom Province in northeastern Thailand. His father was of Chinese descent. His mother was Lao. This mixed heritage was not unusual in this part of Siam, where cultures along the Mekong blended together for generations. When Boonpeng was just 5 years old, for reasons that remain unclear to this day, his parents sent him away from his home village. He was placed in the care of his maternal grandparents, an elderly couple known as Grandpa Suk and Grandma Pian, who lived in a small riverside neighborhood in Bangkok called Bang Khun Pram. It must have been a frightening, disorienting experience for such a young child, taken from his parents, his village, everything familiar, and placed into the bustling, unfamiliar world of the capital city. His grandparents did their best to raise him. They worked as gardeners, tending vegetable plots along the riverbank, and they tried to bring Boonpeng into that same life of quiet, humble labor. But Boonpeng hated it. He despised getting his hands dirty in the soil. Instead, he gravitated towards something entirely different: books, learning, and most of all, the temples. Near his grandparents' home stood a temple called Wat Tewarat Kunshorn, sitting along the eastern bank of the Chao Phraya River. Boonpeng began spending his days there, studying alongside the monks, absorbing their teachings, their rituals, their way of life. He was a bookish, devoted child, the kind of boy who seemed destined for a spiritual path. No one around him could have imagined that this same devotion to temple life would eventually become the perfect disguise for unthinkable crimes. As Boonpeng grew into a young man, he was eventually ordained as a Buddhist monk. And here is where the story takes its first dark turn, because the very things that should have made him a figure of trust and reverence in his community became instead the tools he used to manipulate and exploit the people who believed in him. By all accounts, Boonpeng was an extraordinarily charming man. Handsome, well-spoken, intelligent, the kind of person who could put a room at ease the moment he walked into it. As a monk, he developed a reputation that spread quickly through Bangkok's upper classes, particularly among wealthy women. He was known to practice black magic, a tradition deeply woven into folk Buddhism in Siam at the time, blending spiritual devotion with mysticism, charms, and love potions. Women came to him seeking all kinds of help. Some wanted blessings for good fortune, some wanted protection from misfortune, and many, many came to him for something far more personal: love potions. In a society where arranged marriages were common and women often had little control over their romantic lives, the promise of a potion that could make an unfaithful husband fall in love again or attract a new suitor was incredibly appealing. Boonpeng positioned himself as the man who could deliver exactly that kind of magic. But his rituals went far beyond mixing herbs and chanting prayers. According to multiple historical accounts, Boonpeng would use his position, his charm, and his claimed mystical powers to have sexual relationships with these women, framing it as a necessary part of the love rituals he performed. For a Buddhist monk, this was an extraordinarily grave violation. Celibacy is one of the most fundamental vows a monk takes upon ordination. To break it repeatedly, secretly, while using his sacred position to manipulate vulnerable women was considered one of the gravest possible sins within the monastic tradition. Eventually, his behavior caught up with him. The abbot at his temple discovered what Boonpeng had been doing behind closed doors, and he was swiftly expelled from the temple in disgrace. For most people, an expulsion like this, a public fall of grace, a betrayal of sacred vows exposed for the whole community to see, meant the end of any standing in religious life. For Boonpeng, it was simply a minor setback.
After his expulsion, Boonpeng didn't disappear quietly. Instead, he made his way to a different, far more prestigious temple in Bangkok, Wat Sutat, a temple known for its excellent reputation and prime location in the heart of the city. When Boonpeng requested to join, the abbot at Wat Sutat already knew about his troubled past. Word of his behavior at his previous temple had clearly spread. At first, the abbot refused to let him stay. But Boonpeng was persuasive. He swore with apparent sincerity that he had learned from his mistakes. He promised the abbot that he would dedicate himself fully to the proper conduct expected of a monk, that his sinful ways were firmly behind him. The abbot, perhaps wanting to believe in the possibility of redemption, finally relented and allowed Boonpeng to stay. It did not take long for the old patterns to return, and this time they were worse. Boonpeng resumed his love affairs with the women who sought him out for his rituals. He continued practicing black magic and selling love potions, but now he added an entirely new layer of corruption to his life within the temple walls. He secretly opened a gambling den, operating an illegal casino right there on temple grounds, hidden from the abbot and the wider community. Picture this for a moment: a sacred space, a place where the faithful came seeking spiritual guidance and blessings, secretly transformed at night into a den of gambling, illicit affairs, and occult rituals, all orchestrated by a man dressed in the robes of religious devotion. It is unclear exactly when Boonpeng's behavior crossed the line from moral corruption into outright murder. The full scope of his crimes, how many victims, over what period of time, remains genuinely unclear even today, over a century later. But we do know how it started to unravel, and it began with greed. According to official accounts and Boonpeng's own later confession, his first confirmed victim was a jewelry merchant named Nai Lom. The details of exactly how their paths crossed have shifted slightly between historical sources, but the core of the story remains consistent. Nai Lom came to Boonpeng's quarters at the temple, believing he was there to conduct legitimate business, to sell valuable gems and jewelry, possibly diamonds, to a respected and wealthy monk. What Nai Lom did not know was that he was walking into a trap. According to the accounts passed down through history, once Nai Lom arrived with his case of jewels, Boonpeng and his followers moved quickly. They killed him.
Some accounts suggest the motive was a dispute over the value of the gems, others simply point to straightforward greed for the wealth he was carrying. What happened next would become Boonpeng's signature, the method that would eventually give him his infamous nickname. He instructed his disciples, young monks who had been ordained under him at the temple, to dismember Nilom's body and stuff the remains into a large iron chest. The chest was then loaded onto a rickshaw, a common mode of transport in Bangkok at the time, and hauled an extraordinary 6 kilometers across the city to the other side of the Chao Phraya River. There, it was dumped into a waterway called Klong Bangkok Noi, where it sank beneath the surface. For a time, it seemed the perfect crime. No body found nearby, no witnesses. A wealthy jeweler simply vanished. His disappearance, just another unsolved mystery in a bustling city. In May 1917, the iron chest containing Nilom's remains was washed up in the canal where it had been hidden. But even with a body finally found, investigators had no leads, no suspects, nothing connecting this gruesome discovery back to the respected, charming monk living quietly at Wat Sutat. Boonpeng, it seemed, had gotten away with murder, and rather than stopping, he would soon do it again.
Friends, before we continue with this story, I want to take a quick moment. This case took our research team an unusual amount of time because it comes from over 100 years ago, from historical Siamese records that are difficult to find in English. If you appreciate the depth of research that goes into bringing you stories like this, a like or subscription genuinely helps our small team continue doing this work. Now, let's get back to the story, because what happens next is even more disturbing. Some time after the murder of Nilom, a young woman named Nong Prik came into Boonpeng's life. Prik was only 20 years old, and according to historical accounts, she came from a relatively wealthy family. Like so many of the women who sought Boonpeng out, her reason for visiting him was deeply personal. She wanted a love potion. Specifically, she wanted something that would make her husband fall in love with her again, the way he once had. What began as a simple request for spiritual help soon turned into something else entirely. Prik became Boonpeng's lover, and then she became pregnant with his child. For Prik, this was not something she intended to hide or simply walk away from. She wanted Boonpeng to take responsibility. She wanted him to acknowledge the child and become a present, responsible father. But Boonpeng had no intention of doing any such thing. By this point in his life, Boonpeng had already arranged his own marriage to someone else. A pregnant lover demanding responsibility was not a minor inconvenience. It was a threat that could expose his secret life, destroy his reputation, and unravel everything he had built. So, Boonpeng made his decision. He would kill her, just as he had killed Nilom. According to the historical record, Boonpeng wrote Prik a letter, using an excuse to lure her back to his temple quarters. The letter reportedly mentioned a gold necklace worth approximately 10 baht of gold, an extraordinary sum of money for that era, which Prik had previously loaned to him. He told her he needed to discuss returning it to her. Prik tucked the letter away and made her way to see him, believing this was simply a routine matter to settle between two people who knew each other well. She had no idea she was walking toward her death. When Prik arrived at Boonpeng's quarters, he struck. According to the evidence later presented, Boonpeng strangled Prik to death inside the secrecy of his cloister, the same private quarters where he had conducted his rituals, his affairs, and now his second confirmed murder. After killing her, Boonpeng wrapped her body in a mosquito net before once again calling on his disciples to help him dispose of the evidence. Two of his followers, a 19-year-old named Charon and an older student named Charon, names so similar that even historians researching this case centuries later sometimes confuse them, helped stuff Prik's body into another large iron chest. This time, the chest was filled with bricks,
deliberately added to weigh it down and ensure it would sink completely and stay hidden beneath the water's surface. The two disciples hired a rickshaw and hauled the chest to Wat Sai Ma, a temple situated on the banks of the Chao Phraya River, further upstream in Nonthaburi province. There, they dumped the iron chest into the river, watching it disappear beneath the water, just as the previous one had. For a brief time, it seemed history might simply repeat itself. Another disappearance, another body hidden where no one would think to look. But in early January 1918, fishermen in Nonthaburi province discovered the chest, washed up exactly the same way the first one had been discovered nearly 8 months earlier. Once again, curious onlookers believed they might find treasure in an expensive iron chest like this. Instead, they found a woman's body. This time, authorities frantically began searching for answers, desperate to identify both the victim and whoever was responsible for what was clearly becoming a horrifying pattern. But once again, they had no leads, no suspects, no way to connect this gruesome discovery back to the respected monk at Wat Sutat.
The investigation into Prick's murder began making progress when someone close to the case came forward with crucial information, testimony that finally pointed authorities directly toward Boonpeng. Acting on this tip, police began quietly investigating the monk, but there was a serious problem. They had no solid, concrete evidence linking him directly to either murder. Suspicion alone was not enough to arrest a respected religious figure. So authorities made a public appeal, asking anyone with relevant information to come forward. That appeal worked. A rickshaw driver named Charan, separate from Boonpeng's young disciple of the same name, approached the police with a critical piece of information. He claimed that he had personally been hired by the monk to help dump an iron chest into the river. This was the break investigators desperately needed: a witness, a direct connection, someone willing to testify about Boonpeng's involvement in disposing of evidence tied to a murder. With this new information, police finally felt they had enough to act, and the location where they chose to make their move could not have been more dramatic. On January 14, 1918, police arrived to arrest Boonpeng. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't on the run, he was in the middle of his own wedding ceremony, the very marriage he had once used as justification for murdering a pregnant woman who wanted nothing more than for him to take responsibility for their child. Officers swept in and took him into custody right there, interrupting the celebration, pulling the groom away from his own wedding to face questioning for murder.
While in police custody, Boonpeng confessed. He admitted to killing both Nai Lom, the jewelry merchant, and Nong Prick, the young pregnant woman who had once come to him seeking nothing more than a love potion. But during the investigation and subsequent trial, something far more disturbing came to light. Authorities began to suspect that Boonpeng was responsible for considerably more than just these two confirmed murders. Evidence pointed toward as many as 5 additional disappearances, cases that bore striking similarities to the murders of Nai Lom and Prick. Most of these suspected additional victims were described as alleged lovers of Boonpeng, women drawn into his orbit through his black magic rituals, who simply vanished, likely sealed away in iron chests of their own, dumped into the same canals and rivers that had already claimed 2 confirmed lives. Boonpeng denied any involvement in these 5 additional cases. He would only admit to what investigators could already directly prove. His trial took place in a Bangkok court, and the case against him relied heavily on testimony from his own disciples, the young monks who had assisted him in transporting and disposing of his victims' remains. Their accounts, alongside recovered stolen valuables, including gold and jewels taken from his victims, alongside the grim physical evidence found inside the iron chests themselves, painted a damning picture for the court.
Two of his disciples, Charan and Charon, the young monks who had helped dispose of Prick's body, were charged as co-defendants in the case. What ultimately happened to them afterward is not clearly recorded in historical accounts. They simply disappear from the documented history of this case after their testimony. On August 12, 1919, the court delivered its verdict. Boonpeng was found guilty of murder in the deaths of both Nai Lom and Nong Prick. Given the severity and brutality of his crimes and the sheer audacity of using his position as a respected Buddhist monk to lure, exploit, and murder his victims, the court showed no leniency. He was sentenced to death. On August 19, 1919, Boonpeng was led to a public execution ground at Wat Pa Si, a temple that also served at the time as a tax collection site in what was then a district of Bangkok, now known as Wathana. There, in front of a gathered crowd, Boonpeng was executed by beheading, the traditional method of capital punishment used in Siam at the time. What makes this moment particularly significant in Thai history is not just the brutal nature of Boonpeng's crimes, but what his execution represents in the broader story of the nation's justice system. Boonpeng's beheading on that day would become the very last public execution by beheading ever carried out in Thailand. After his death, the kingdom transitioned to more modern methods of execution, eventually adopting firing squads in the years that followed. In a strange and haunting way, the man who used ancient black magic rituals to manipulate and kill his victims would also mark the symbolic end of an entire era of Siamese justice, the final beheading in a tradition stretching back centuries. Boonpeng was buried at Wat Pa Si Temple, the same grounds where he had been executed. You might expect that to be the end of his story. It was not. In the decades that followed Boonpeng's execution, something remarkable and deeply strange happened within Thai folk culture. Local communities began to believe that, with the passage of enough time, even a soul as dark as Boonpeng's could eventually be purified. A shrine was built in his name, dedicated to his spirit. Today, more than a century after his execution, that shrine still exists, located at a temple in the Ekamai area of Bangkok. Visitors affectionately refer to him now as Uncle Boonpeng, no longer remembered primarily as a brutal serial killer, but reimagined instead as a friendly spirit, one believed to offer protection from evil to those who come seeking his blessing. People visit this shrine to this day, seeking luck specifically in matters of love and fortune, an almost unbelievable twist of fate, given that Boonpeng's entire criminal history was built on exploiting people's desperate desires for exactly those two things. Local legend even holds that all 7 of his iron chests, the confirmed murders and the suspected additional victims, remain buried somewhere beneath the temple grounds to this very day. Boonpeng's story did not fade into obscurity after his execution. It became something closer to folklore. In 1967, his case was retold in a radio drama, which was later adapted into a feature film. In 1980, a second film was made based on his life. As recently as 2006, a direct-to-DVD film once again brought his story to a new generation of audiences. A killer who once used the guise of religious devotion to commit unspeakable crimes has, in a strange and complicated way, become a permanent fixture of Thai cultural memory, equal parts cautionary tale and folk legend. The case of Boonpeng Heap Lek stands as one of the earliest documented examples of serial murder in Thai history. A case so significant that historians and true crime researchers alike consider him potentially the country's very first known serial killer. What makes his story so unsettling, even more than a century later, is not simply the brutality of his methods, the iron chests, the dismemberment, the deliberate weighting with bricks to ensure his victims would never be found.
It is the disguise he wore while committing these crimes. Boonpeng did not lurk in shadows or present himself as dangerous. He wore the robes of a monk. He performed sacred rituals. He was trusted, sought after, even revered by the very community whose members he would eventually exploit and kill. His victims came to him voluntarily, seeking love, seeking blessings, seeking protection through black magic, and walked directly into the hands of the person who would end their lives. This case also reveals something deeply important about the limitations of justice in that era. Without modern forensic science, without DNA evidence or advanced investigative techniques, authorities relied almost entirely on witness testimony and confessions to bring Boonpeng to justice. The 5 additional suspected victims were never confirmed. Their families, if they ever came forward at all, never received any answers about what truly happened to their loved ones. We will likely never know the full scope of what Boonpeng did during his years as a monk in Bangkok. What we do know is this: at least 2 people, a jeweler simply trying to conduct honest business and a young pregnant woman who only wanted her child to have a father, paid for their trust in him with their lives. More than 100 years have passed since iron chests began surfacing along the rivers and canals of Bangkok. The man responsible wore the saffron robes of religious devotion, used ancient rituals of love and fortune to draw people toward him, and then took everything from them: their trust, their safety, and ultimately their lives. Boonpeng's execution marked the end of public beheadings in Thailand, but it did not mark the end of his story. Today, his name lives on, not buried beneath the weight of history, but transformed instead into folklore, into films, into a shrine where people still come seeking exactly the kind of blessings his real victims once sought from him: love and fortune. Perhaps that is the most unsettling part of this entire case. A century later, people are still drawn to Boonpeng, still hoping he might give them what his real victims believed he could provide, right up until the moment it cost them everything. So with that, the case of Boonpeng Heap Lek, Iron Chest Boonpeng, comes to an end right here. This case is a reminder that the most dangerous people are not always the ones who look dangerous. Sometimes they wear the very symbols of trust and devotion that we are taught never to question. If you know of a real case, historical or modern, that you feel deserves to be told, write the name in the comments below. We research every single suggestion carefully. If this video added value to your day, a like and a share genuinely helps this channel continue telling these stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so now. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and be careful who you choose to trust.